It is really a pleasure to welcome you this evening. I think you'll be very pleased that you took the time to come out for this presentation. Marlborough Public Schools is proud to partner with Kathy and her group, the Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition. Many of us sit on this group and attend monthly meetings. We also partner with the Marlborough Hospital. So this is brought to you tonight in this partnership, and we believe in the city of Marlborough that it's very important to have that partnership. None of us can do this work alone. This is really a second phase of very important information around this topic. Last year, we were privileged to have James Wahlberg here talking to our 7th graders, our 8th graders, our 9th graders, and then we had a community forum in the evening that was very well attended at the Whitman School, and that centered on the film that he directed called If Only, and you probably all have seen it or heard of it. So this is really a discussion, the topic of which is the adolescent brain and the physiology of addiction. We are delighted to have Dr. Ruth Potee here with us this evening. I'm going to have Ellen come on up in a minute with a couple of housekeeping. If anyone needs Spanish or Portuguese interpretation this evening, we do have some simultaneous devices. Christine, you want to stand up and raise your hand? Christine will help you with the Spanish portion, and Jolie with the Portuguese. Also, I want to direct your attention, if you didn't see it when you came in this evening, please stop by and see it on your way out. We had the idea to incorporate artwork of students here at Marlborough High into this evening. Sheldon Vigent, one of our very talented staff members who used to teach history, and now he's an art teacher, directed his classes with his advanced studio art classes to create a Behind the Layers Unpacking Addiction art show. The pieces are powerful as the pieces are the text next to them. So take a moment to reflect on that as you leave. Ellen Carlucci from Marlborough Hospital. Thank you.
Good evening. We are proud to be here on behalf of the hospital and the partnerships that we have throughout the community. It's a great opportunity for us to take a few minutes and listen to an expert on what this means, what this crisis is in not only our community but in our country. At Marlborough Hospital, we love to take care of you when you're sick. However, we are obligated to help keep you healthy also. And so it is very important for us to continue to work with our partners in the community, such as the Marlborough Public Schools. We are proud to sit on the coalition that Kathy is the chairperson of, but we really want to make sure that we take a leadership role in educating people as to how do you stay well, how do you stay healthy, how do you teach individuals about the importance of not taking risks, or what are the consequences associated with risks that you might take. Each of us have been impacted by this epidemic in some way, shape, or form. And we are really honored and privileged to have someone such as Dr. Potee come to us tonight to speak and to help us. And the goal is to continue to push this information out. Whether there was one person here tonight, 50 people here tonight, or 100 people here tonight, if we can impact one individual, it has been a successful program for that one individual. And that one individual also has loved ones who would be impacted if that person makes a bad choice. So thank you again for attending. We know how busy everyone is, but we appreciate your support. And now I'd like to introduce Kathy Leonard, who is the chair of the Marlborough Substance Use Prevention Coalition. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Thank you, Kathy.
subject. I don't think there's anybody, especially in this room, that hasn't been affected. This topic is important to me personally because I have been affected in the worst way possible. I lost my son almost 3 years ago, it'll be 3 years in December, to a heroin overdose. So I know the heartbreaking path of what addiction does to a person who struggles as well as to the family. So it's really important to me to educate, inform, and let people know that there are ways to get help. There are tools out there that have information. In addition to running the coalition, I also co-facilitate a group called Metro West Hope, if you're interested in that. It's for families who have someone struggling as well as someone who struggles, so there's information about that out there as well. You know, a lot of times we forget what we need to do, or we don't know what to do, or we're lost, we don't know where to find information, so please reach out to us. Dr. Potee's presentation tonight is also available. The slides that she will show are available, so there is a notebook out on the Substance Use Prevention Coalition table. If you are interested in those slides, put your email down there, she'll send the slides to me, and I can send them out to you. She's a very busy woman. There's a whole list of things up here that she does that I was going to read, but it's out there on the screen. So I'll keep it short and let her tell you what she has to say. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Ruth Potee. Thank you so much for
So one of us is going to, I think it'll look better if we get, is there any way to get the front screen off or not clear? Can you guys see, there's a lot of really detailed slides, and I want you to be able to look at the slides, but what Kathy says is absolutely true. This slide deck is available to anybody in the room. You can go give this talk tomorrow, wherever you want. You can say you did the whole thing, I don't care, right? I would love it if I actually had this taught in part to 5th graders and 7th graders in a health school, a health class. You don't need to take the entire slide deck, but you can imagine taking 7 slides and building a curriculum around it. So again, this is available, but we're also going to maybe try to find a way to put it on the school website, and I'm going to email it out that way too. So people should have access and use it, and that was an awesome thing that the principal just did. Thank you. This is the first time, I go out every Thursday night somewhere in New England and speak. This is the first time I've ever had the head of a hospital here, and I think that is awesome and very helpful. Community hospitals actually take the brunt of this epidemic because community hospitals are really poorly funded, really rely on funding from Mass Health. When you're really sick, struggling with addiction, and you have a spinal abscess and endocarditis, you cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I'm not saying that to blame people who struggle with the disease, but when community hospitals are already running a really tight budget, yet they're managing this disease on a day-to-day basis, this is how our little tiny hospitals stop existing. So it's really important to support your little hospital, but it's also amazing to have their presence here. So we're going to talk about the brain. We're going to talk specifically about how the brain is impacted with all addiction. And the part that we're going to focus on is what's known as the reward circuit of the brain. And that's sad because I'm just clicking away up here. It's not moving. Give me a second. I wonder if it's going to be a distance issue, but I'll try not to wander. Can I ask the cameras, if I pace, are you going to be mad at me? Okay, yeah, they lied, but that was nice of them to say that. So I think it is going to be a separate thing. So here we're going to talk about the reward circuit of the brain, and this is the cover of National Geographic in September. Did everybody read this? It was the Physiology of Addiction cover. If you don't subscribe to National Geographic, the time has come. Man, it's an awesome magazine. And I thought this was a really good article. It was really scientifically accurate. It has all these great websites where you can watch video about it on the National Geographic website. But it details, in good detail, the different parts of the brain that are impacted with addiction. And we're going to focus on the 3 areas that I think are most specific, which is the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. What this slide shows you is it's really complicated. The brain breaks in a specific way that I make very simple tonight for you guys because it's really hard to understand this. I'm an addiction-trained doctor and a family doctor, and I've been to a multitude of national conferences, and most of the lectures on this stuff I walk out and think, holy smokes, I didn't understand that one either. So I definitely simplify it, but one of the reasons I show the slide is it is a complicated breakdown of the brain. The reward circuit of the brain is the most elemental, ancient part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that tells you to live or die. It tells you to survive today. Every day your brain wakes up and it says, I need to find food, water, and guess what? Nobody thinks this way, but I need to find a mate so I can send my genetic material forward. Nobody woke up this morning thinking like that, I know that. But from an evolutionary standpoint, your entire body is designed to survive long enough that you can procreate and create the next generation, right? That is how we are designed to have been on this planet, and guess who hasn't evolved? We have not evolved, right? It takes millions of years to evolve. So this is the most critical, ancient part of the brain, and yet it is the part of the brain that is impacted with addiction. And if we could, with a magic Harry Potter wand, move addiction to the visual cortex or the hearing part of the brain, and all you did is you lost your peripheral vision when you got addicted to something, so what? I would say you don't get to pitch anymore, right? I'm taking you off the baseball team. You don't get to drive at night anymore. It'd be a really easy problem to fix. But instead, the part of the brain that says, should I live or should I die today, is the part of the brain with addiction. And that is why it's one of the hardest diseases I treat on a day-to-day basis. So the chemical that's racing through this reward circuit of the brain, the neurotransmitter, is dopamine. I'm not going to spend much time on serotonin, which governs a lot of our mood, anxiety, memory. Dopamine is this transmitter that gives you this incredible sense of joy and euphoria, and holy smokes, that was awesome, I need to repeat the behavior. Your ancestors had beautiful dopamine, right? Which is why we got to be in this room. This front row here, their ancestors were terrible at this circuit of the brain. They don't exist anymore. So we're actually incredibly grateful for this reward circuit, right? It kept us alive and allowed us to exist. This dopamine has two behaviors associated with it: compulsion and perseveration. 200 years ago, living in Marlborough, Mass, or living anywhere on this planet was really hard, right? I mean, just put yourself 200 years ago. You were really hungry. You were barely scraping by. The cold winter is coming. You're going to desperately try to keep your family warm and your livestock alive to get you through to the spring. Your average life expectancy was 30 years old, right? Things were hard 200 years ago. Things weren't so easy 50 years ago either. And you went to bed every night, and the last thing you thought of is, how am I going to get enough food and water to keep my family alive? That's what you did. And the first thing you woke up in the morning was that exact same thought, right? That's how you survived, is you were perseverating and compulsive, right? Awesome behaviors when it comes to survival. Apply those two behaviors to addiction. And who's in the room is medical? Nurses, right? What do you guys do?
School nurses.
School nurses. So did anybody ever work in the ER? Do you guys do ER time? No. Well, so one of the things that happens when you're in medicine, and the people at the hospital can attest to this, you see people, a lot of the same people for their same disease all the time. And it can get really, really frustrating, right? You get frustrated with your people who struggle with alcohol use disorder, and it's the 5th time you've seen them in the ER that month, and you kind of get mad, and you want to dope slap them and say, dude, pull yourself up, get over this is a real problem. But if you could take a breath and remind yourself, perseveration and compulsion, those are two of the behaviors that actually define the disease of addiction. This brain is on this desperate, terrible loop in the reward survival part of the brain that it cannot seem to break. So when we talk about dopamine, I make an argument that we have at a baseline a certain amount of dopamine in our brains. And I make an argument that most of us sit about 100 units of dopamine, and some of us are unbelievably happy. There's a silver lining to every dark cloud. People, we're problem solvers, right? We know who we are, right? There's a lot of us in this room. Our dopamine set point may be 105. We feel good. Somebody just pointed at somebody right over there. Got that. She's 107, that woman right there, okay? There's a lot of us whose baseline dopamine is on the lower side, though. Maybe we're sitting at a dopamine level of 85 every day, sort of the Eeyores of the world. Eeyores of the world come to the doctor a lot. I spend my day with low dopamine people, right? They're feeling terrible. They can't seem to get better. They're on a pathway that doesn't seem to be shifting. They're stuck, right? Stuck in the muck. So when your baseline dopamine is 100, and you're living in central Massachusetts, and you find that 5-point buck, and you kill it, and that allows you to keep your family alive for a full other week, and you get a nice warm high that might be able to keep your baby alive through another winter, you get a spike in dopamine. Your dopamine spikes to 150, and it goes back to normal. You have sex, it's consensual, you have an orgasm, your dopamine spikes to 200, and then it goes back to normal. That is how your brain is designed. It's designed to give you a little squirt of dopamine as a reward for behavior that allows you to survive. Awesome, right? You use a drug like cocaine, your dopamine will spike to 350. When you use a drug like a strong prescription opiate or fentanyl or carfentanil or whatever you get your hands on, your dopamine will spike between 500 and 900. And when you use a drug like crystal methamphetamine, your dopamine will spike to 1300. So what's amazing is that more of us don't wake up every day and take a hit of meth, right? Because it would feel to you like that's a good idea, right? Like, I just said something 6 times great orgasm. I'm in, right? I think that's a good plan tonight, right? So the problem is, evolutionarily speaking, well, let me just back up and say, let's remind ourselves how the dopamine works in the brain. There's 3 things that govern the equation with dopamine. How much dopamine is produced, how many receptors are on the other side of the synaptic cleft receiving the dopamine information, and how many little vacuums are sucking out the dopamine from the active part of the brain. And cocaine is the drug or the behavior that has the cleanest mechanism of action. It does one thing, and it only does one thing, but it does it really beautifully. It turns off the vacuum. Whoop! Vacuum shuts it down. And when the vacuum's not on, there's nothing sucking the dopamine out, and that's how you got yourself to a dopamine of 350. I'm not going to walk through every drug or every behavior because I'll torture you guys, and there's a lot of these pathways we still don't understand. The way that heroin works is more complicated. It goes through the mu opiate receptor, and it goes then through a negative feedback loop to the GABA system. At the end of the day, all opiates make more dopamine, okay? So it's a more complicated slide, but at the end of the day, it just pushes more dopamine out there. So the problem is that when the brain sees dopamine of 150 or 200, that is in keeping with the 200,000 years that we have been in this human body in this exact form, right? Your brains have seen that before. No big deal, it can handle it, right? All good. When the brain starts seeing dopamine levels of 350, 500, 900, 1300, your brain says, holy smokes, there's something wrong here, right? There is something dreadfully wrong with my brain because this is not in keeping with how I am supposed to exist on this planet. And the brain starts to down-regulate. It turns down the volume. So it stops making dopamine. It erases 80% of the receptors on the other side of the synaptic cleft, and it turns on every vacuum in sight. So when you struggle with an addiction, you wake up in the morning and your new set point dopamine is certainly not 100. It's not even 85, right? You're not even an Eeyore when you get out of bed. Your new dopamine in the morning is about 40. That is not in keeping with really surviving, right? It is hard to be pleasant to anybody. It's hard not to want to kick your dog for waking you up. It's hard to pour a bowl of cereal for your kids. It's hard not to call my office and drop the F-bomb on everybody on the planet, right? These are miserable feeling people. And the only way that they know to make themselves feel better is to return to the behavior, to return to the substance. And that will bump them up again. Are they ever going to see a 1300? They got 1300 once in their life, right? You never get that again. Their goal on a daily basis is to not be sick with withdrawal, but 2, to feel normal again. So they continue the drug, they continue the alcohol in order to boost their dopamine back up to an 80, right? That's what you do on a day-to-day basis, even though you know it's destroying your life. Even though that you know that your mom is sitting at home crying. You know all of this stuff, right? The rational brain understands that. But this part of your brain says you cannot feel this bad, and the only possible way for you to feel normal is to continue to shoot up today. It leads to this concept of a broken brain. And it is not any different than any other disease I take care of on a day-to-day basis. So, UMass Medical, this happened today at the ER. I can say it with 100% certainty because this happens at every single hospital in our country on a daily basis, okay? So this 68-year-old guy is in that top right corner, and he lives in Northborough. And he looks at his wife and says, I'm not feeling so good. And she takes a look at him, and he's gray, and he has blue lips, and she's like, holy smokes, he doesn't not just look so good, he is terrifying. So she calls EMS, and in 2 minutes, EMS is in their living room, and they're looking at that guy, and they give him a sublingual nitroglycerin and a sublingual beta blocker and an aspirin, and they put in a big bore IV with some morphine, and they transmit an EKG from Northborough to UMass. And UMass says, holy smokes, stop what you're doing, throw that guy in the truck, he needs to be here in 6 minutes, we're warming up the cath lab. By the time he arrives, they say, forget the cath lab, this guy's going to the operating room, and he ends up with a quadruple bypass for his giant anterior wall heart attack that he's having. He survives all that, and he ends up in the cardiac ICU for another 5 days, and then he's sent to the floor for another week where he gets a lot of medical attention, he has a few complications, He gets a social work consult because he's going to get depressed, and he gets a follow-up with a brain cardiologist who gets to see me as primary care doctor. He goes to cardiac rehab for 12 weeks. He gets full 12 weeks of family medical leave act through his job. How much money would you spend on that guy? If somebody said $500,000, closer to Boston rates, maybe $250,000. We just spent a lot of money, okay? So his next door neighbor in Northborough is that young woman you're seeing on the screen on the right? She's 24 years old and she's a heroin problem. Both of her parents know she uses heroin. They're terrified for her every single day. They fret over her. They're trying not to enable her. But the truth is they feel helpless every day. And so one morning when they knock on the bathroom door and it's locked and there's no response, that mom gets an adrenaline spike and kicks it in. She carries Narcan on her body at the house because she's prepared for this. She calls 911 first because that's always the right thing to do. She administers the first dose of Narcan, but that young woman doesn't come back to life. 911 arrives, and in Northborough, police, fire, EMS, everybody carries Narcan. They probably all arrive at the same time, and it actually takes almost the entire supply of every one of those units to have this young woman wake up again. She gets put in the truck and gets brought down to UMass ER. What happens to her? What was that?
Sits in the ER.
She sits there for a while. She's vomiting. She's acute diarrhea. Her dopamine is 32 right now, and she's in active severe withdrawal. Right. So maybe she's sitting there not feeling so good. What else happens to her? She gets arrested. Is that what somebody just said? Yeah, I actually think in Massachusetts we would not arrest her, right? We don't arrest people for using it. I'm not in a scary state right now. I'm in a state that understands that addiction is truly a disease, and we probably wouldn't arrest her. But she's likely to walk out. I agree. She either gets seen and evaluated and says, well, she's not actively suicidal. She didn't intentionally do this, so I don't have to find a bed for her, right? So yeah, she gets discharged, right? We didn't offer her very much. Let me go back to my 68-year-old guy. Okay, both of his parents had heart attacks in their late 50s. In fact, his dad died at the age of 59 of a massive MI. His mom died at 72 of a stroke. He smokes a pack and a half a day. He kicks back a 12-pack of beer every day. He goes to McDonald's 3 times a week. I am his primary care doctor, but I've never met the guy. Actually, I have one time, 4 years ago. I told him he had high blood pressure. He never followed up, and he never took his medicine. Does this guy have addiction? What's he addicted to? Yeah, alcohol, nicotine, fat, sugar, right? He's certainly not addicted to like running or anything. Did he create this disease? Yeah, he's 68 years old, and he actually exhibited the lineup of the worst possible things you can do, including he had bad genetics to start with, the worst possible things to do to guarantee you're going to have a heart attack, right? But did you walk in as his EMS provider into his living room and say, you know what, I'm not going to provide care for you today? Because you made some terrible choices, right? Just terrible. I have no interest in spending $250,000 on somebody who makes such terrible decisions in their life. So I'm going to leave you in your living room with your wife, and you can just die in the next 32 minutes. Right? Did that happen? Is that the care we provide in this country to people? It is the care we provide to a certain subset of people, right? It's the care we provide to people who struggle with addiction. Period. Right? Most diseases, I'm a specialist in chronic disease. I'm a family doctor who takes care of sick primary care patients all day. That's what I do for a living. My job is to take care of chronic disease. And all day long, I sit with people who are not the healthiest specimen. Do I have a perfect person in this room? Where's my marathon running vegan? Are you that? You look pretty healthy. The Queens of all looks really healthy too, right? Are you running marathons? I knew it. Did I pick him out as a triathlete? Is there another, I have somebody else back there? Okay, you're pretty darn awesome. I'm impressed. I have 2 perfect human beings in the room, but the rest of us are not, right? The rest of us are struggling. I took care of a guy this morning who weighed like 370 pounds, and he tells me this every year when I see him, and it doesn't make me laugh at the time because I'm always scolding him, but he eats a box of ding-dongs every morning for breakfast. Every morning, right? My medical assistant didn't even know what a ding-dong was. I had to Google image it and teach her what it was. But like, this is a guy who's been a godsend, right? He's terrible. All of his disease states are miserable. He eats terribly, and I will never change his behavior. I've known him for years, and I've made no movement, right? But do I stop providing his care? Do I fire him? Do I say, you're ruining my numbers? The insurance company's not going to reimburse me because if you're a disaster? Of course I don't. I hold him closer. I provide him more services. I called my case manager to help reach out to him and get him a health coach. That's what I did. I give my sick people more stuff. I don't take it away. And the reason I do this work, right, the reason I'm not with you guys on Thursday night and not hanging out with my family is because I am so outraged by this disparity in care, right? And everybody in this room is outraged by it too. It's outrageous. You know how much I learned in medical school about addiction? Close to zero. And the only reason I learned anything in residency is I went to like the best addiction hospital in the country, which is Boston City Hospital. So the truth is, most people that you take care of, and one thing I'm going to charge you with, some of you are going to see your primary care doctor the next 6 months. I want you to ask that person, what are you doing to help people with addiction? Do you recognize when people struggle with alcohol use, and do you get them the treatment that they need? Are you helping people who are struggling with opiates right now? What are you personally doing to stem this tide? Because most of us out there in the medical community are doing a big, fat nothing. Nothing. And it ticks me off. My attitude is get up out of your chair and work even harder because we have young people who are dying. Left and right. We're losing 91 Americans every day to death by opiates. It's unacceptable. And guess who brought this to you? Woo! Medical community, thank you very much, right? And the pharmaceutical industry, like, hugely so. Okay. I gotta get closer. Okay. So let's go back to dopamine. I just want to say I didn't make up the dopamine story. That middle column is a happy, healthy brain. And all that orange you see in the middle is dopamine. The column on the right are brains of people on PET scan who are struggling with addiction. That top brain is cocaine, the next one down is meth, third one down is alcohol, and the bottom one is somebody with heroin. You can't see it in the back because they're not great images with the lights on, but the alcohol brain has a surprising amount of dopamine in it right now. And the reason I like this slide is it reminds me to say to you that I'm going to talk about alcohol because I do actually think alcohol is one of the most deadly legal drugs in our society, right? Tobacco is actually the #1 killer. But the wheels come off the alcohol bus pretty late in the game. There are a lot of us who are functional alcoholics. We go to work every day, we take care of our kids, we volunteer at things. But, you get your second OUI, or your wife walks out of you, or you actually lose your job, the wheels start to fall off that bus. So people function fairly okay for a while, even though they've lost control of their drinking. 3 things are going to predispose us to developing addiction. Genetics, early exposure while the brain is developing, and a history of childhood trauma. Having poor mental health does not necessarily create addiction. It is often, though, a subcomponent of everything else. Genetics and poor mental health, there's a huge overlay there. When you're 15 years old and you're terribly anxious and you start drinking or using marijuana and you realize all of a sudden, wow, I'm kind of the funny guy when I'm drunk, right? I'm like the life of the party when I'm drinking. And that becomes your new normal, is to be the teenager who drinks way too much in order to fit in. It's not that your anxiety or your social anxiety is what caused the addiction. It's that you expose the developing brain early to an addictive substance in order to self-medicate, right, for this thing that you struggle. So it's not that those of us who have kids or ourselves who have depression or anxiety or mood disorders in teenage years are necessarily going to get addiction or lead towards addiction. It's just that the other things can overlay on top of it. So the genetics of addiction are some of the strongest genetics of any disease we know. If you have a parent or a grandparent who struggles with addiction, you have about a 50% chance of developing addiction yourself. So who needed to hear that little piece of information? How many people in this room have talked to your kids about their genetic risk of addiction? So that is a shockingly high number, but you know what you guys are in this room? You guys are a really well-informed group who has a lot of motivation on this issue, right? The average, I would say, parent out there has not ever once talked to their kids about this. It terrifies them, this concept, right? It terrifies all of us, right? I mean, like, your kids get what they get for their genetics. They don't have a choice. And you feel kind of terrible to say, hey, look, my friend, this is what I said to my kids. We have a really strong genetic risk of addiction in our family. And you don't get to have any say in that. You need to know about it, because the next thing that I'm about to tell you gets to shift the entire thing. And if you do the next thing well, you get to almost entirely erase your genetics, right? So that's why you tell your kids. Not because they're helpless, but because they actually get to change it, right? That is why you need to tell your kids about your genetic risk of addiction. addiction. So parent or grandparent, not great aunts or cousins, but I'm talking about immediate family members. There are very few diseases that have this level of genetics. ADHD does. ADHD is like 70%. Like when I'm trying to diagnose a kid with ADHD, I'm like, tell me about your history in your family. I'll be honest, I know already. I got mom and my grandmother in the room. The room is a mess. Nobody's telling me a linear story. None of the forms got filled out. Like it is you see the chaos when you walk in the house, when you walk in the room. So addiction is a developmental pediatric disease. All addiction starts while the brain is developing. And I say this with increasing confidence, that if you hit the age of 23 or 24 and you have not used an addictive substance, you have not been using marijuana, you are not drinking, you have not been smoking cigarettes, you're not going to develop addiction. It's almost that easy, guys. I mean, how crazy is that? If I said to you, you will never have diabetes and you will never struggle with adult obesity if you avoid orange food dye number 4. I made that up because none of that's true. But if I said that to every 7th, 8th, 12th grader out there, every one of them would never eat a Cheeto ever again, right? Like they would never ever do it. Because I'm talking about one magic thing it takes to avoid this really deadly disease. Except the avoidance is hard, I don't deny that, right? But when you are sitting down with your kids who are struggling, or you're sitting down with your kids when there's really strong genetic history, all they need to do is avoid the addictive substances while their brain is developing, and then they get to cancel out their genetics. That is amazing. You don't get to do that with any other disease. So when you talk to somebody who struggles with addiction, I always ask the question, how old were you when you started? And I always do the 3 easy ones, marijuana, alcohol, and nicotine. And what's the average age that most people tell you? Yeah, I was 12, 13, or 14, right? 12, 13, or 14. Those are the numbers that spill out. Remember, 12, 13, 14. What is that? 6th, 7th, 8th graders. Right? Done. 5th grader, right? 6th, I mean, those are the ages when it starts. So I get this talk at the jail, because I'm the doctor at the local jail. So I'll have 150 men, I happen to run the men's jail, in a room. And that room setting, everybody has addiction. And I'll say, who is 12? Every hand is up at 12. And then I start counting down, 11, 10, 9. I have hands in the air at the age of 6. Their first exposure to an addictive substance, right? I mean, that makes me physically ill. And you think, how does a 6-year-old do that? How do they light a match? How do they know, right? Oftentimes parents or another adults giving it to them, actively giving it to them. Sorry, okay. So if you're 15 years old and you start drinking here is defined as 2 drinks a week. 40% of those 15-year-olds go on to be alcoholics. If you wait until the age of 21 to start using alcohol, 7% go on to be alcoholics, which is about half the rate of today's alcoholism rate in this country. Think of that chasm, guys. 40% versus 7%. That's a huge thing. And again, the message that I send to you now is just your kids have got to delay their use. They have to be the kids who are not showing up at 15 years old or 17-year-olds at the after football party drinking. You can never ever, 1, because it's illegal, but 2, because it's the wrong thing to do. You can never be the house that thinks you're protecting teenage brains by posting alcohol in your house. I mean, like I know there's still a lot of parents that do that. And I'm not going to throw Metro West under the bus at all on this. I'm actually going to go further east on this front. But I tell you, those western W well-off suburbs, there's a tremendous amount of alcohol consumption. There's a lot of normalized behavior with alcohol consumption. I was at a school recently just east of here where the parents were tailgating at sporting events with like kegs of beer in the parking lot of the school. And I was like, you have got to be kidding me. Like, I was appalled. I'm looking at my uniformed officers in the back. I'm like, that is not allowed, right? What kind of role modeling is that? The kids in the school had twice the average of alcohol consumption of nationwide standards. It was the highest I've ever seen in the state. And this is because the parents do it. They have giant beer fridges in every garage. There's just this concept of the beer fridge in the garage, which is a concept I was unaware of, but I live out in the country, we just don't do that sort of thing. But kid, is your garage totally locked? Is there no way to get into your garage? I don't know, my garage is open to the entire world. So kids hop from like garage to garage, drinking out of people's beer fridges. Does that feel like healthy choices in a community? The standard there is set by the adults, right? So if you can prevent, particularly for those of us who have strong genetic history, the exposure while the brain is developing, you will make a huge difference. Our kids, in fact, are actually making the best decisions about substances that we have seen in 40 years. So I actually give this talk in some other version to kids, rarely, because I work a lot of jobs, but I actually spend a lot of time patting them on the back, because the norm is kids don't use anything. The norm is your kids are working like dogs, trying to get through high school and make some friends and perform on an athletic field and get to college. Your kids are working so hard. The problem is what feels like the norm when you're in high school is the group in the back who are smoking pot every day, right? They feel like the norm because they're loud, right? You talk about them a lot. There's a lot of chit-chat about what they did over the weekend. They get kicked off the field hockey team for their bad behavior, and that's the conversation that governs the world for the next 3 weeks. Part of the work that great prevention entities like Kathy's entity does is normalizing normal behavior, which is not using. And the truth is, again, our kids make awesome decisions. And you should spend a lot of time telling your kids who are doing well what a great job they're doing and reminding them that's the norm. So kids these days practically never smoke cigarettes. If you ask the average 15-year-old what they think about cigarettes, they are disgusted by them. They really are. In a high school, I'll ask, and they're like, they start listing all the medical problems that cigarettes cause. The problem is that the sense of harm with cigarettes has gone up, the sense of harm with pot has gone way down, right? So what do the average teenagers say about marijuana? It's better than drinking, better than alcohol. What else?
No big deal.
No big deal. Got this. No big deal. What else?
It's not addictive.
It's not addictive. I won't get addicted. What else?
Medicine.
It helps me sleep. It's medicine. It helps my anxiety. It cured my dad of cancer. I got that one the other day. What else? It's legal. Okay, so far that's the only true one, right there. It is legal in Massachusetts, right? That's the first true one. There's one more that they say that is true, which is largely true. It will not cause an overdose. You will not have an overdose death from marijuana. I think that's by and large true. Have there been deaths associated with marijuana? Certainly motor vehicle deaths, yeah. There have been psychosis deaths. People jumping out of buildings or killing somebody with a handgun because they're psychotic, because it definitely causes much higher rates of psychosis and earlier rates of schizophrenia. But actual true overdose straight from marijuana, that is true. It won't kill you. It'll make you sick in other ways. So the kids have this very strong belief system that they believe very deeply. And guess what? A lot of their parents do too. I mean, do you guys see this? Do you guys have a lot of marijuana use that you could tell? Do you remember what your numbers look like in the community for marijuana use last 30 days for seniors? Roughly? I don't know. Nobody knows. We'll know. We'll look them up. Okay, so this is what happens. There are 3 things that happen between the ages of 12 and 24. There are things every single day that are happening in the middle school and in this high school. The first one is something called synaptic refinement. There are tens of billions of synaptic connections in the brain. That is that incredibly tangled mess of a brain you see up there. You do not need that many synaptic connections, and in fact, it's very unhealthy for you to have a brain that looks like that. The teenage years are all about pruning back. The only time in your life you get to prune back in a healthy way is during adolescence, 12 to 24. And you sure as heck hope they're cutting back the right stuff and holding on to the right stuff. There are times during adolescence where they're losing 30,000 synaptic connections a second. Right? You'd like them not to be with their bowl of pot in the basement when that's happening. The second thing that happens during the stage is something called myelination, or you're ensheathing these rapid highways in the brain, efficiency in the brain. Because again, the brain is incredibly inefficient while it enters into adolescence, but by the time it comes out, it is a brain that is a fast-thinking machine. So, our teenage brains that we take care of in this school and as parents and as grandparents are awesome. They are normal. They terrify me. They tick me off as a mom of 3 teenagers. But these are amazing brains. They are pushing the limits every day because that brain is trying to sort out what does it need to hold on to and what does it need to get rid of. Consequently, their brains are all act first, think later. Less consideration for negative consequences, less than optimal planning, more risky, impulsive behavior. Emotions are felt incredibly intensely. Who's raising a teenage girl in the room? Right? I mean, seriously. Right? I just saw some eyes rolling. I can walk in the house. She can tell me I'm great. She loves me. She tells me sometimes I'm pretty. 7 seconds later, I am being screamed at. She's crying. I haven't said a word. I haven't taken my coat off. I just stood in the kitchen, right? And I have no idea what flipped that switch because the emotional valence of these teenagers is extreme, right? They all look bipolar to me. They're not, but they feel that way. There's a very strong preference for physical activity and sensation seeking. We all want those kids to be triathletes because we're trying to exert out all their physical energy. There's never a time in your entire life when you're more impacted or influenced by your peers. And I want you to pause about that. When your 7-year-old went off to 2nd grade and one of their friends said, let's go do something on the playground, they were like, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm going to tell the teacher, right? And when you were 27 and one of your bozo friends said, let's go do this stupid thing, you're like, you're an idiot. I'm not going to do that, right? Like, you make really good decisions for most of your life. But during adolescence, when one of your peers says, let's go do this, you're like, I'm in, right? You're in. Because evolutionarily speaking, the adolescent period is about finding your herd, right? Think of adolescence from all mammals, right? At the time you're an adolescent, you've been booted. Nobody wants you in the family anymore. Your hormones are crazy. You've got to go out and make your own way because you're yet another mouth I can't afford to feed, right? So you booted out those teenagers immediately. How fun would that have been, right? Just to like scoot them out of the house a little earlier. I love my kids, but I'm ready to scoot them. So the point is that the teenage years, you have got to find your peers in order to survive. It makes sense that they're doing this, but there's never a time where it matters more who your kids' friends are. And it's why you guys really need to know who your kids' friends are. My 13-year-old was having a sleepover at somebody's house. I actually didn't really know the kid, and I'm like, I'd like to call the parents. She's like, why would you do that? I'm like, because you're going to somebody's house, and I don't know them, so of course I'm going to call them. She looked at me like I had 3 heads, and I think to myself, that's so crazy. Why would she think I would let her go spend the night at somebody's house who I have not met, right? Who I have not formally introduced myself, given her my information. You know what else I did? I didn't tell her this, but I asked that mother if she had guns in her house and were they kept locked. I live in the country. That's a common thing. I also asked, do you have, she didn't know quite what she actually does. I live in a little town. Everybody knows who everybody is. I said, do you have any medicines that are lying about, or does anybody in your house consume marijuana in a way that's going to be concerning? And she's like, and she had this great conversation. She didn't think I was a lunatic, right? I think she's glad I called. Anyway,
Yes.
right? She was glad I called. Okay, so we talked about these 3 critical things that happen, but I only told you about 2 of them, the myelination and the synaptic refinement. The third thing that happens during this stage is you lay down the final receptors in the outer cortex of the brain. The number 1 receptor you lay down is dopamine. This is why all addiction is a developmental pediatric disease. Is the dopamine receptors get laid down in the cortex, the final shell of the brain, which is why dopamine, which you guys now know all about, is so impacted with early exposure. The other receptor that gets laid down is something called anandamide. No idea. I've never heard of anandamide before. I went to a medical school where neuroscience was huge, and I went back and I looked at my notes thinking I must have slept during that class. No mention of this receptor because it was discovered since I graduated. So anandamide, we think, is the receptor that helps determine what stays and what goes in the brain. During this adolescent phase of cutting back, it's this receptor that helps determine it. The problem is that anandamide is the mirror image of THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. Okay? That's a big problem for us. So when you look at marijuana and its role it plays in the brain, anandamide looking just like THC, and here we are making decisions about this really critical phase of brain development. THC is like a sledgehammer when trying to determine what stays and what goes, while anandamide has been around for a long time as a scalpel helping to make these decisions. So when I talk to anybody about marijuana, I often use the following sentence, which is after the age of 25, when your brain is fully developed, I actually don't really care if you use marijuana, because I don't think it is any worse than alcohol. I don't want you on my roads. I don't want you driving anything ever. I don't want you operating on my knee or taking care of my kids or changing the lug nuts on my tire. But what you do in the privacy of your own house after your brain is fully developed, I don't care. Do I use marijuana? I don't. I don't like that sort of thing. But what other people do, I don't think it's worse than alcohol, period. Under the age of 25, I think marijuana is a neurotoxic drug to the brain, period. And there is nobody out there who's going to convince me otherwise, but I'll tell you, every teenager out there, they're sitting there on their smartphones while I am talking to them, like fact-checking me, challenging me. If they could throw tomatoes at me, they would be, right? The pushback on this is huge. Because if you Google anything about marijuana, the first 999 pages is all positive stuff, like how good it is. Because you know what this industry has behind it? Billions of dollars, right? Follow the money on marijuana, my friends. The industry needs to hook as many young people as possible. So what does marijuana do? This is all studies that are based out of Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Europe, but it affects attention, verbal learning, memory, processing speed, and those effects continue even when you're not high. I really like this study, and I know it's going to be hard for you to see. I'm going to talk you through it. It compares what happens to people who used marijuana a different number of times during adolescence, between the ages of 15 and 21. And I'm going to compare the two extremes because it's most easy to see. I'm going to compare the top light gray bar, which is teenagers who used it 0 times between the ages of 15 and 21. And I'm going to compare it to that dark red line at the bottom of each bar graph. Those teenagers used marijuana more than 400 times in a 6-year span. But I want to say something clearly. That is not a lot of use, right? That's using it every other day for several years. That's all I'm talking about. It doesn't take much to get to 400 uses of marijuana during adolescence. Our teenagers who are using marijuana, they take their first hit when they wake up in the morning. They're vaping it in the bathroom at school. They take it at 2:30 when they get home. They use it to get through dinner with their parents, and they smoke it before they go to bed. That's the way my kids with marijuana use are using marijuana, okay? So I'm comparing the two extremes. The likelihood of gaining a degree from a university by age 25, if you have used it 0 times, is 36%. The likelihood, if you've used it 400 times or more, is 2%. The likelihood of being unemployed by age 25, 0 use, 21%, and you're going to compare that to 52% of kids who use it 400 times or more. When you look at being dependent on welfare, so again, this is from Australia and New Zealand, where I think is a more prominent welfare state, but the kids who used it 400 times or more dependent on welfare, 57%. You know what we have, my friends? We have a generation of failure to launch, right? I've got kids with couch lock playing video games in my basement. This is not what we needed for this next generation coming up, guys. This is not a positive outcome. So same studies or similar studies, an 8-point drop in IQ by the age of 35. The problem with every study I just showed you is it's based on the old THC. It's based on the marijuana from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. That marijuana was 3% THC or less. There's not a single DEA confiscated marijuana plant in this entire country that is less than 9% to 16% THC. We are growing a much more potent product intentionally, right? So here I am showing you data that makes a lot of us feel a little anxious, right? But I'm telling you, I'm not even talking about that product anymore. I'm talking about something that is 6, 8, 10 times more potent, right? You think that's improving your IQ? You think that's less toxic to the brain? You think it's having a smaller impact on the anandamine receptors? And this is the real problem, right? When you hand your kid, not that you would ever do this, a big fat rolled up joint, a lot of them look at that and they don't even know what that is, right? Because you know what they know is they know this stuff. These are the concentrates. This is butter and shatter and earwax. Doesn't that look like earwax? It's disgusting. This stuff is between 70% and 90% THC. And it will be coming to a marijuana store near you starting this summer of 2018. Feeling good about this, aren't you, right? You can eat marijuana, you can spread it on your skin in a cream, you can put it under your tongue as a tincture, it comes in milk and spaghetti sauce and beer, you can vape it, you can smoke it, there are 1,000 ways, and you know who knows how to use all of this? The average teenager out there, because if you Google it, everything you need to know is there. So the real problem is what I mentioned already, is this industry is designed to addict as many of the young generation as possible. Because in order for industries of gambling, of cigarette smoking to survive, they have to addict people. That's the point. That's the business model, right? So in Colorado, every one of these pictures comes out of candy sold in stores in Colorado. This stuff is sold as gummy bears and gummy words and in candy bars that are intended to really target kids, young people. And every one of those candy bars has 12 servings of marijuana in it. And the last time you guys shared a Kit Kat with 11 people was never in your entire life, right? And when you look at the back of those candy bars, they too are 70 to 80% THC. And the absorption of marijuana in the gut is very variable. You can take it and you'll be sitting there and be like, I'm not feeling anything. And an hour later, you take 2 more servings, right? You're still not feeling anything. because the gut absorbs marijuana very strangely. And 5 hours later, you've eaten the whole candy bar, and you are acutely, severely psychotic and insane, and you're hanging out, taking up 2 bays in the Marlborough Hospital, right? That's what Colorado ERs look like now. They just have units that are just filled with people really, really, really too high to be doing anything but being surveyed in an ER, right? Good use of American healthcare dollars. So, you know what, my friends? We've done this already. We learned all of this from big tobacco. In the year 1900, less than 1% of Americans smoked cigarettes, and then the industry took over. And the first thing they did is they began growing tobacco leaves with thicker veins, because that's where nicotine is. They grew a more potent, more nicotine-laced tobacco product. That's the first thing that happened. And then they began to reformulate nicotine, or tobacco, into tiny little thin paper-covered sticks called cigarettes, and then they put all kinds of other chemicals that made them even more addictive and taste even better, right? This is what I'm describing. We have done this before. The industry takes over a natural plant that at normal potency may have some medical benefit and may help some people with intermittent use. But all of a sudden I have something that's 70 to 90% THC that's being distributed on every block of Boulder and of Denver, and if you think your kids aren't going to get access to that, they are. By the year 1950, 70% of American men were smoking cigarettes. That's a big number, right? If the Obama-era healthcare pathway had remained in place, the prediction was by the year 2025, rates of cigarette smoking would be 0 in this country. Largely 0, right? Because we really worked hard at getting people off cigarettes. But instead we have taken this and handed the entire tobacco industry over to the marijuana industry, where they will make a ton of money. And what we do not know about the harms of marijuana far outweigh what we think we know. So welcome to the next 20 years. And I feel most badly actually for the uniformed officers in the back, because they're the ones who are going to have to be dealing with people who are way too high to be driving. People who drive on marijuana think they're really good drivers, right? Because they're really slow, right? That's not necessarily good. Their response time to everything is miserable. Okay, I know that's a lot in marijuana, but I needed you guys to hear this because I think the level of knowledge about marijuana is really low. And I think if everybody had heard that talk before the November 2016 ballot, it wouldn't have passed. That's what I think. And instead, people get told, there's billboards everywhere. You guys have a lot of billboards around here that are like, oh, marijuana's all good, put out by Weed Maps or whoever that is. You know, our kids are getting Snapchat messages normalizing marijuana use. Our 13-year-olds are getting this stuff. It gets put out to them. You think you know what your kids are looking at in their phones? You have no idea. Most of us are so technologically behind our 13-year-olds, right? Our kids see stuff that we have no idea about. And you get it and you believe it's true. You guys know that. I don't need to tell you that. So let's talk about alcohol. 1/3 of us in this country drink absolutely 0. And 1/3 of us in this country drink very, very lightly. 1 or 2 drinks a month, a drink a week, very, very light social drinkers. And the final 1/3 of us drink all the rest of the alcohol. And in fact, the final 10% of us drink on average 9 to 10 drinks every single day. Now, most of those drinkers aren't with us tonight because you probably need to start drinking already to get that many drinks in these. But people often think that doesn't seem possible. And I say, oh no, it's actually quite easy to get to 9 to 10 drinks a day. Because these days, I don't drink Bud Light. I actually live in a world where we have really good local craft beers. I'm a total hoppy beer girl. I drink a beer that's like 7% alcohol. So every time I drink a beer, I'm really drinking a beer and a half, right? That is what it counts as. So you've got to do your math on how much you're drinking. The real problem with me these days are all my women I see. So today I spent the day taking care of lots of women, and I said to every one of them, tell me about your relationship to alcohol. And many of them said to me, oh, you know, I have a couple drinks at night. And I'm like, oh yeah, what are you drinking? And they're like, you know, I have some wine. And I say, oh, that's great. How much wine goes in your wine glass? And they say, I have no idea. So most of us have giant wine goblets. Giant, right? We all know that, right? Nobody's using your grandmother's 1965 wedding glasses. God knows where they are, but they're not being used at your house. And what I say to everybody I take care of is, I need you to pour 5 ounces of a liquid into your wine glass and acknowledge that's 1 drink. That's it. That's all. I'm not shaming and blaming you. I just need you to understand what you're drinking every night. Because many of our women, and I'm going to talk to the women in this room, a lot of us have been up since 5, and we were dealing with last night's breakfast dishes, and we had to walk and feed the dog, and pack lunches, and start the laundry, and then somehow have a shower, get dressed, head off to our own jobs, work 8, 10, or 12 hours, and then go home for another 6 to 7 hours of work that we do at our house. Women are drinking more than we've ever seen in history, and this shift happened in the last 15 to 20 years. When I was at Boston City Hospital, my specialty was alcoholism, because that's what we specialized at Boston City Hospital. My dad trained there exactly 50 years before I did, and I swear to God I was taking care of the kids and the grandkids of the same alcoholics that my dad cared for. And on one hand, I could count the number of women I took care of with alcoholism. Just they didn't exist. They were all men, all of them. And the ratio of alcoholism from men to women used to be 9 to 1. But in the last 20 years, it has shifted now to be 6 to 3. Right? It's very rare that you have a public health shift that fast. Women are drinking vast quantities, mostly of wine, partly because it's become normalized behavior, right? You go out with your girlfriends and you drink. You go to a party, and I want every adult in this room to ask yourself this. You go to a party, how often do you go to a party, with kids or not, where alcohol is not a prominent part of it? It's actually really unusual to have a party or an event with kids present where alcohol is not present. That is the norm for many of us. And the argument that I'm going to make in this room is that every time you come home from work, after a crappy day at work, looking tired, and what your kids see is before you put your bag down, you've popped off the top of a beer bottle, or you're uncorking a bottle of wine. The message you send to your kids is when you're stressed, when you're overwhelmed, the solution is to drink. If everybody in this room walked in the house after a terrible day at work and just said, I'm going to go for a walk with the dog right now because I've had a miserable day, who wants to come with me? I have John Kabat-Zinn meditation app on my phone. I've had a miserable day. I'm going to go sit down in the living room, and I'm going to do a 10-minute sit-down meditation. Anybody else want to join me? What if you guys are able to model really healthy behavior to manage stress, right? Your kids would be able to do it too. We should be piping in mindfulness-based meditation into school every single day, period. There are strategies and curriculums all throughout the country that do this work. I have never known a more stressed-out generation than the kids who populate this school every day. They are miserable, right? Every one of them is being told, they don't really have a chance of getting into college, because getting into college these days is 100 times worse than it used to be. It's terrible, right? And my guess is this school is full of hard-driven kids. Okay, so think about how you're using alcohol and why you're drinking. What's it all about? Okay, let's talk about the third thing that predisposes you to addiction. I did the first two. I said genetics. I said early exposure while the brain is developing. It was so long ago that no one's going to remember this. And the third was a history of childhood trauma. So who in this room knows what an ACE score is? I have one person. What do you do?
Social work.
Awesome. That's the right answer. And very predictable. I love it. Somebody else know what ACE score is? What do you do?
Behavioral health and counseling.
She's a behavioral health. So very predictable. But the truth is, I would argue that everybody in this room should know what an ACE score is and know what your own ACE score is. So adverse childhood experiences. This is a study that came out in 1986. Came out of Kaiser San Diego. And it's an unbelievably well-designed study. And in this study, they asked 17,000 Kaiser patients, they were all adults, and they said, reflect upon your years living at your home, the first 18 years of your life, and answer the next 10 questions, yes or no. Nobody's going to see them, I'm going to read them to you. Not all of them, I'm going to read some of them. Holy smokes. Can't even see that myself. Okay, ready? Did a parent or another adult in the household, often or very often, swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you feel that you might be physically hurt? Did a parent or another adult in the household, often or very often, push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or you were injured? Were you sexually abused? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you, thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other? Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or that your parents were too drunk or too high to take you to the doctor if you were sick? Were your parents separated or divorced? Was there somebody in your household who was incarcerated? Was there somebody in your household with major mental illness? Did you watch your father physically harm your mom or your stepmom? 10 questions. I may not have asked them all, yes or no. This is a measure of neglect, abuse, and household dysfunction. In this country, 54% of us score at least a 1. That's not a surprise. Divorce is on that. I score a 1. My parents were divorced. Otherwise, there's nothing on that list that happened to me. If you score a 6 or higher on an ACE score, you're going to die 20 years early. If you score a 4 or higher on an ACE score, you have a much higher rate of having a heart attack, 30 or more broken bones, multiple sexual partners, emphysema, asthma. What does asthma have to do with growing up in a crappy household, right? That's what you would think to yourself. But the truth is, growing up in chaos with neglect and abuse is one of the biggest predictors of who is going to struggle with chronic disease. This should be a vital sign. That's my new thing, right? We did this whole pain is the fifth vital sign, and we started the whole opiate epidemic. I actually get ACE scores on almost all of my patients now, right? Because that guy who's eating ding-dongs every day, right? Like, I'm missing something with him. I am missing something with the guy that I see once a year with chronic diseases, and I can't figure out how to help him. The truth is there's some backstory that I'm missing, and an ACE score often allows me into a place with somebody that I've never been to. Often into a place that they haven't been to recently either. There's a lot of tears that get shed in my exam rooms, I'll tell you that. Having a high ACE score is one of the highest predictors of who's going to struggle with addiction and who's going to struggle with chronic pain. Because when you grew up in a household where you feared for your life all the time, where your adrenaline cortisol response was on fire, your fight or flight response of, oh my God, I live in fear, is on 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, every organ in your body gets impacted. And if there's one thing that we can all do as adults in this room is to help protect our kids and help recognize, again, uniformed officers, recognize when people are struggling at home and get our kids more help. This is the work that our schools do every day. You know who knows kids' ACE scores? School nurses do. They didn't do the test. You're actually not supposed to deliver this test to kids. But they baseline know whose kids are struggling. They just know that stuff. Teachers know this stuff. Guidance counselors know this stuff. And the problem is when you have a kid who is a victim of trauma, because that's what this stuff is, you actually need to get them trauma treatment. Trauma treatment's not drugs. Trauma treatment isn't even really talk therapy, right? It doesn't really work. You have to approach them in different ways. So being what's called a trauma-informed community or a trauma-informed school is absolutely critical. And this is a wave that is happening around the nation, right? There are school districts in Massachusetts that are really focusing on trauma and what it does to our kids. It is very school-based. But it means, though, that I have two behavioral health people in the room. You need to know in your community who treats trauma, like who's good at this stuff. And if you don't have anybody, they've got to get good. So again, I live in the most rural, poorest part of Massachusetts, and my behavioral health community has rallied. It took us a few years to get there, but I have trauma-trained treatment people who do EMDR, rapid tapping treatment, EFT. I have trauma yoga teachers that come to my treatment center and come to the jail. What? Where did that come from? You know what it was? It was just changing. We just had to shift people around. We had to inform people to understand how critical this is. In a hospital setting, in an ER, the ACE scores are through the roof. Okay, everybody in the room knows about ACE scores. You want to Google this stuff, you will learn a ton. Okay, 3 things. Genetics, trauma, and early exposure. And the message you send to your kids is you've got to talk to your kids. Talking to them in 10th grade, what? The horse is so out of the barn at that age. This is a 5th grade conversation. The beginning conversation is in the 5th grade. You're not talking about how to shoot heroin in 5th grade. You're not talking about that. You're talking about the harmful effects of addictive substances at that age, right? You're going to talk about cigarette smoking and that marijuana, and you're going to think about your own behaviors around alcohol. I came home from work one day, I stopped at the hardware store, and I locked up all the alcohol. And my kids were like, Mom, what is up with you? Do you not trust us? And I was like, no, I don't trust you. You're a teenager. I know what we did in the 1980s with alcohol. So the fact that I'm a parent of young people, they were a lot younger then, and they live in my house, and I have this really problematic substance in my home, it should be under lock and key. And they were like, wow, she's a lunatic. But you know what? I'm not a lunatic. My kids in general, they know this stuff. And my kid who I launched off to college, I looked at that kid and I said, I know you're going to drink. I just know you are because you're going to college. You know the data on our family. You know the data on what alcohol does to the brain. I'm urging you to use it as little as possible. I have a kid who drinks very little, if any. You know what really happened to that kid? He learned CPR. He learned basic life support. He learned first aid. So when he went to his first party, the first night of college, and I never talked to him. I'm not a hover parent. He calls me when he's in trouble. I know I have a lot of belief he's gonna be good. And later on, I was like, how'd college go? And he's like, well, my first night I spent in the ER. I was like, uh-oh, that's not good. And he said, yeah, I was at my first frat party, and there were 2 kids who were dropped down drunk. I brought one of the kids home and put him in bed. I turned them to the side to make sure they didn't vomit in their lungs, and I realized the other kid was too sick for that. So I spent the night in the ER with him. He spent 5 nights his first year at Brown in emergency room settings. with kids who are dropped on drunk. And you know why? Because he felt like he was responsible. You know whose kids are responsible? Every one of your kids. Your kids are actually active bystanders, right? They can be trained to be the ones who are looking around that frat party and thinking, that guy over there is too drunk to be near that woman. He is hanging all over her, right? That is an assault waiting to happen. He's my friend, he's my frat buddy. I need to evacuate him from the situation before something bad happens. That young woman is getting hauled up the back stairs. I need to stop that, because nobody looks as though they're making a sober enough decision to make a decision about sex tonight. And you know what? You have 1/3 of a room who are active bystanders, then we would be preventing assault, right? We could do that. So I say make sure your kids are trained in things. Make sure they feel like they're the ones who are the most responsible. And celebrate them for that. So seriously, basic life support, CPR, all that. One day Ben texted me, I was at work, and he said, I need Narcan. And I almost threw up, because I'm at work, and I'm like, why does my kid need Narcan? He said it in sort of a semi-urgent way. So I called him right away. I was like, why do you need Narcan? He said, no, Mom, it's good. I'm an RA, because he's an RA. And he said, it is spring fling weekend coming up, and I have kids shooting heroin in my dorm. And I'm like, holy smokes, I am paying $73,000 a year for Brown University, right, with a bunch of kids who worked really hard to get there. And I do walk into his dorm on a given week, and it smells like pot at 11 in the morning, which disappoints me enormously. But to know that I had kids who are actively shooting heroin, that's a problem. So he has Narcan. I brought him Narcan that day. Your kids can have Narcan too. You just have to go to the pharmacy and get it for them. Okay, so I'm going to skip. I am going to say this. Our kids are making the best decisions they've ever made. The one exception when it comes to tobacco or nicotine use is e-cigarettes. So the e-cigarette rates have really gone high. This part of the state tends to have big vape rates. Do you guys find that? Do you guys collect data in the school district? Was that a yes? Okay. And it's not fair that I'm just looking at the administrators and expecting them to know their numbers. I should have asked you to give me your numbers ahead of time. Sometimes I ask for that, but I was a little disorganized. Because I like to look at school districts' numbers and compare them to other districts and compare them nationally. But we do know that the vape rates are really quite high, partly because teenagers think it's all good. It's just a flavor, right? It's just cotton candy flavor, right? So it's different than chewing gum. The problem is this is a largely unregulated industry. The stuff comes from China. We have no idea what's really in it. A big chunk of it has nicotine in it. So you know what I just did? I took a 16-year-old who thinks she's getting a cotton candy flavor, and she's actually now addicted to nicotine. What? How would I help anybody with that? It's terrible. So e-cigarettes are a problem. The other thing is they use these vape pens and they put cannabinoids in them. They put THC products in them. And then they're using them in the bathroom and they're undetectable because it doesn't smell like marijuana. So again, welcome. Who's my school resource officer in the room? Do I have one here? Do you guys have a school resource officer? You must, right? They're just not here. The school resource officer knows your data. He knows, or she knows, the collection of the vape pens. It happens everywhere. Okay, how are you guys doing with the iGeneration? You're loving parenting this too? You're loving that glowing device in your kid's hand that you can't seem to extract, right? Has anybody had any trouble with this? You find it really easy to turn it off? It's really easy to limit your kids' use of their iPhone and their iPads? Anybody figured it out yet? No, I'm not going to talk much on this. I'm going to just acknowledge that this generation is going to struggle with a couple addictions. One's going to be pot. The other one is going to be just they cannot stop looking at their phone. And this is not me being a crazy mother. When I took my kid's phone, I read this article. This is an article that came out in September, right? I'm showing you 2 articles that came out last month. This is in the Atlantic. And you should get this article because you're going to get these slides and study up on them. But this article on have smartphones destroyed a generation is a really terrifying article. My husband and I literally read it the same night on different sides of the house, and that night we're like, holy smokes, we're being terrible parents. We did not have the control we needed to have. Your kids have access to the entire world. They are seeing stuff that nobody should ever be seeing, and you just do not know. And don't you wish you had a magic switch that just turned everything off? Once you hit an hour or 2 a day, all devices powered off, right? Why doesn't that exist? Right? I know Comcast has something, but I've been trying to use it and I can't really figure out how to use it, right? It's not easy enough to control this stuff. And who feels like their kid may have an addiction to their something? Does anybody feel that way? They get really mad when you try to limit their use, right? This is a real problem. So this is a good article. Okay, so opiates. I know people think I'm going to talk about opiates the whole time. This is the final 10%, but I want to not miss this. So every morning, I'm a family doctor, I take care of really old people who are dying. And every morning I wake up and I read the obituaries and I drink my coffee. It's always my everyday routine. Is that funny? Does that sound bad? It's not bad, right? It's all good. Because when you're a family doctor, you gotta know who died last night. I have to call the family and I have to fill out the death certificate. I'm not being morbid, it's what I have to do, it's my job. So I read the obituaries very faithfully. And in December of 2012, 5 years ago, I read the obituary of the young woman in the top left in the city year jacket. And her obituary read, Ashley Sims, age 21, died of a heroin overdose at home. And I thought to myself, I know Ashley, and I know her grandmothers who raised her, and I called them to express my shock and sorrow, but to tell them how grateful I was that they told the truth about how Ashley died. Because for years in advance of that, I'd been reading obituaries of young people dying unexpectedly at home. And we all know that unexpected deaths at home are really two things. They're suicide or they're overdoses. And unless the end of that obituary says, please give money to the Dana-Farber or the Lymphoma Leukemia Society, these were unanticipated deaths from people who were really struggling. So these two grandmothers who raised Ashley went to the local newspaper in 2012 and said, you must tell the story of what is happening to our community. We have all these people who are addicted to pills or to heroin, and they're really sick, and nobody is talking about this. And so the Greenfield Reporter, the county seat of my tiny little county, 15,000 people, began running first-page stories every day on the opiate problem. And then our little county really leads the way in Massachusetts in terms of response to the opiate epidemic, in terms of the interrelations between law enforcement and the courts and treatment and the jail and schools. We really are very integrated, because when you're tiny and you all went to high school together, you actually do really well working together. So this was for me the beginning of sort of launching into this world. There's no doubt in my mind that pills are on the hook for this epidemic. There's no doubt that the overprescribing of opiates during the last 20 years created this problem. When you look at the country in terms of the rest of the world, the U.S. prescribes more opiates than any other country by a big margin. When you look at accidental deaths, opiates remain far outpacing every other cause of accidental death, including gun violence, motor vehicle accidents. 91 people dying every day now outpaces the peak of the AIDS epidemic, right? This is all stuff that's preventable that is now taking over. When you look at the nation in terms of opiate deaths, that top map on the top left is 2003. The red areas are places where people die of drug overdoses. And you just watch the entire country light up. Not quite the entire country, but a lot of it. So the truth is, Massachusetts was a low prescribing opiate state. We always were. There weren't pill mills in the state. It's always been against the law to both write a prescription and dispense a drug. I am not a pharmacist. I cannot hand you a pill in my office. It's against the rules of Massachusetts. Lots of states that was not true for. So I-95, when I was in my early part of my practice, was always known as Oxy Highway. I-95, we routed up from Florida from the pill mills. There were over 600 pill mills in the state of Florida. Vast quantities of opiates. And there would be tour buses that would go down to Florida. They would be sponsored by whomever, and you would have free hotel and all your meals paid for, and all you needed to do was to walk into 2 pill mills a day with a wad of cash that you were given to use in your hand. You didn't need to limp, you didn't need a diagnosis, you didn't need any medical records. And you were handed a bag of pills and a stack of prescriptions, which you then handed over to your tour operator, who then brought it back to Kentucky and Western Mass and Maine to sell it on the streets. It was a very lucrative business. For 10 good years, this is the way it rolled. And then the federal government looked at the state of Florida and said, if you cannot get your problem under control, we are going to cut off funding, all federal funding to your state. So in the year 2009, the pill mills of Florida were shut down. 34 doctors went to prison because they weren't actual doctors, although they were actual American-trained and licensed doctors, but they were drug dealers. They're still in jail. I hope they stay in jail forever. But the problem is you had most of the eastern seaboard with a big chunk of people addicted to opiates, and you now have cut off the pipeline, and what are you left with? Right? The unintended consequence of cutting down on pills is you're left with heroin, and heroin is a far deadlier drug with a much higher rate of overdose. So you're left with this unbelievably pure, cheap heroin that has been spread from Mexico starting in 2007. It's very high-tech how it comes to this country. It is very based on texting and flying and FedExing. Ubering, lifting, this stuff moves fast. It is not particularly a violent operation, moving heroin around the country, and no wall will prevent this from coming into the country. There's no building of a wall that will change the outcome here. So when you look at the map of the nation and you ask EMS workers, what's your number one drug of concern, those dark green areas, the answer is heroin. But what's amazing to me is I just told you about I-95, like what's up with the Southeast? You would think the Southeast would light up, right? Why doesn't it light up? The answer is this, which is that there remain between 1 and 1.5 full bottles of opiate per person in that part of the country. We did never prescribe heavily in Massachusetts, most of New England did, but the rest of the country still has vast swatches of land where people prescribe huge amounts of opiates, and those pills are on the street. And when pills are on the street and are cheap, you don't need heroin. When pills get shut down and you're addicted to something, that's when you turn to heroin. So when you look at the country and you look at heroin, it's the red and the orange states are the heroin states, right? But if you can imagine the CDC, the FDA, the DEA shutting down the prescribing patterns in all of those purple states, then every one of those purple states will become a red state. And if you think that Louisiana and Arkansas and Oklahoma are building methadone clinics and are carrying Narcan in every patrol car and making sure that the school nurses have Narcan in the schools and doing education forums like this at night, I don't believe it. I don't believe anybody in the Southeast is spending money on public health prevention right now because they're about to be hit by the tsunami that has been hitting us for the last 5 years. And what we predict is as many as 500,000 deaths by opiate overdose in the Southeast in the next 5 years. Right? It's not a pretty time. This is the first quarter where we actually, in Massachusetts, had a flattening of death rates. The first quarter in the last 6 years. So are we ahead of the game? No, we're not actually. But at least for the first minute, we've slowed it down a tiny bit. You know what it takes to change that? One bad batch of fentanyl. That's all it takes. We get one batch in from China, it gets distributed out of Holyoke and Lawrence and through New Bedford, and those numbers will shift in 1 week's time. We've just been lucky. So our kids in general are not using a lot of opiates. When you look at the rates of current opiate use, it's incredibly low. And why is that? Because my hope is that everybody in this room has no prescribed controlled substances at their house. If you're actively prescribed those things and you're actively using them, they belong in a safe. Your kids should never have access to a prescription bottle. Your 5-year-old will die if they accidentally take your lisinopril. It will kill them. When my kids have a headache or their leg hurts them, they must ask an adult in the household whether they can take Tylenol or Motrin, period. That's the rule. That should be your rule too, because your kids know nothing about medicine. And guess what? Most of us don't either, right? Like, when I talk to adults about the difference between Tylenol and ibuprofen, most of them are like, I don't know, I thought they were the same drug. And I'm like, no, they're not. So your kid, one of the first things that your conversation with your kindergartner is, you find a pill, you get an adult. Any pill you ever find, you get an adult, because that's an emergency situation. Does that mean? Maybe. So in general, our kids are not using a lot of pills because these fruit bowl parties of yanking every drug out of the medicine cabinet, that's a 2010, 2011, 2012 phenomenon. At this point, if you have drugs in your house from a leftover knee surgery, what are you doing? Get them the hell out of your house and get them to the police walk-back box. The fact that I am talking on this subject in almost 2018 is killing me. Like, this is a conversation that's 5 years old. Every police station has drug take-back. You guys have drug take-back? Right? Is it anonymous? Yes, right? You can bring anything you want to your drug take-back. Don't flush it down the toilet. That's bad for the environment. When police take them back, they tend to incinerate them. Is that what you do? You may not know. But I think that's what most people do. Is it bad for the environment? It probably is somewhat bad, but it's not as bad as putting them in the water system, okay? So police take back, go through your medicine cabinet, talk about lock and key under lock and key. Okay, so our kids do get opiates. Where do they get them? They get injured, right? They get an ACL tear because they're a soccer player. They get their wisdom teeth out, right? So who had a kid with a wisdom teeth out? And how many were you prescribed? She prescribed, he prescribed. Do you remember? Okay, a week's worth. And so that's a lot, by the way, a week's worth. And somebody else said the word 30. 30. And was that recent? Or was that a few years ago?
A couple years ago.
A couple years ago was 30, okay. So that I would say, I've been asking that exact question for 5 years. I've been giving these talks on and off. 5 years I've asked the question of how many you were prescribed, and the answer was always 30. It always used to be 30. Now I get the answer routinely, I got 12, right? So when you look at the national or the statewide averages, we're down to, with the oral surgery root canal, we're down to 16. Now when I ask the question, how many did your kid use? How many? 2? How many did your kid use? Used all of them. Oh, that was a bad surgery then. Okay. I wonder what a weak supply is. I'm curious what that really looked like. So the average answer, though, when I asked how many did you use, was 0, 2, 4, or 6. I rarely get anybody who used more than 6 of an opiate with an oral surgery. So the truth is your kids should have been prescribed 6. If they needed more, guess who's on call? Somebody's on call, just call the doctor, right? So the overprescribing, my hope is that's getting better. But you really, as a parent, you really want to prevent your kid from being exposed to an opiate, right? And one of the questions you ask, if your kid's injured, is what can I do for pain management that does not involve an opiate? What can I do to protect my kid's developing brain? I'd like them not to be exposed. Give me some regimen that does not addict them, right? Every clinician out there should have the capacity to say, well, that's an interesting question. Let's talk about some strategies that limit the amount of opiates that you may need to use, right? It's easy to do. We have a 17-minute video that we give to student athletes that addresses some of this stuff, right? It's on my website. I'll show it to you. Okay, so this is from Learn to Cope. I happen to love Learn to Cope. I think Kathy's group sounds awesome too. I love any support groups that are for families because I tell you, this is a terrible disease and it destroys lives and it destroys families and it's heartbreaking. 1,000 times over, it's heartbreaking. I cry every day talking to a family member. But these are things that you may find in your kid's room, and you need to be the kind of parent who does not baby your kids. Your kids should clean their own rooms, they should do their own laundry. I walk into my kid's room, my heart rate goes up, and my blood pressure goes up. I do a lot of yelling, but I don't clean their room. But I do go through their things, right? I make sure they don't have any pills in their room. They should not be having Benadryl in their room, ever. They should not have Tylenol in their room. That does not belong in their room. If I see a straw in their room, they don't know this, I freak out internally. Because for me, straws are ways of crushing things and snorting them. My 13-year-old doesn't think that way yet, but she knows I hate straws. I tell them I think they're unenvironmental, because I think they are unenvironmental. But if you found a straight-edge razor in your kid's room, tell me your alarm bells would be through the roof, because I guarantee you they're not glazing their windows, right? They're either causing self-harm or they're cutting drugs. So when one of my kids was really depressed, I really went through his room really well. And, you know, we camp a lot. I got pocket knives everywhere, but I removed every self-harm device I could, right? Because kids feel terrible, will do anything to feel different. And I don't know who in this room has had somebody who struggled with cutting, but it's a pretty common thing to happen. So look in your kid's room for things that might get them in trouble. My threshold is I want to figure out my kid is struggling with addiction 3 months in. I know that seems like a small goal, but I take care of families who had no idea their kid was struggling for 3 or 4 years, right? It's a really big difference to help somebody who's been addicted to something for a few months versus somebody who's been addicted for years. It's a big difference. So pay attention to your kids' rooms, go through their stuff. They live with you. Their room is your property as far as I'm concerned. I know I seem like I'm the meanest person. Okay, if you have somebody in your life who you love and you're worried about them because you think they may have an opiate problem, you should carry naloxone or the opiate overdose reversal agent called Narcan. It is available in any pharmacy in the Massachusetts, specifically Walgreens and CVS, without a prescription. But last week, DPH came out with a new guideline that says every pharmacy in the state of Massachusetts must dispense Narcan without a prescription. I don't remember what it takes into effect, sometime in early 2018. But right now, Walgreens and CVS, you can walk in without a prescription to get Narcan. It runs under your insurance. You can always get Narcan from Learn to Cope, and they will teach you to use it. It's extremely easy to use. You shoot it up somebody's nose. It is no big deal. What if you give it to somebody who's having a seizure? You causing them any harm? No. Are you helping them with their seizure? No. You call 911 100% of the time first, right? I can squeeze Narcan up every nose in this room. Unless you're on chronic opiates or chronic pain, in which case you'll be mad at me, I won't cause anybody any harm. Okay, so I'm gonna, 2 more slides and I'm going to be done. I'm going to just say for a minute about what it takes to get better. People get better with addiction. Not 100% of the time. We lose people all the time, right? And there's some people that don't get better for a really long time. But lots of us know people who've gotten better. We have a lot of people probably in recovery in this room. What does it take to get better? It doesn't take one thing. It takes 10 things. It takes 7 things. It takes a whole host of things going your way. And when I sit down with somebody with addiction, I draw a big circle and I say, Your wheel looks different than anybody else's wheel. What is it going to take for you to get better? Everybody's wheel has a slice of the pie that's sober housing. If you are going back out to the place where your boyfriend is actively using in your house, you will not succeed. You will fail. If you're going back to a relationship where your wife is a heavy drinker and you're struggling yourself, you will not make this work. You need to find housing that is structured and sober. And we need to support structured sober living in our communities because it is a hard thing to find. And then I say there's a lot of other things that it will take for you to get better, right? You need good mental health care. We need to help any mental health disorders you have. You need to have a purpose, a plan, education, a job, feeling like you have some value on this planet. You need an animal to love. You need a person to love. You need somebody to love you. You need to restore your miserable relationship with all the people you've ticked off in the last 5 years. Build your pie in front of me, and it will change day to day. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs something. I'm a big believer in medically assisted treatment for addiction. I use a lot of medicine for alcohol. There's a lot of different medicine to help people get off opiates. I refer to methadone. I prescribe buprenorphine. I've been a prescriber for 17 years. I believe that everybody gets better in a different way. I am not a person who says, you've got to go to 90 meetings in 90 days is the only way to get sober. It is the way for some people. But the amount of judgment in the addiction community is really high, and it always ticks me off, right? You've got to support people the way that they're going to get better. And you have to throw a lot of different things their way. Some people's pies are really complicated. That's a simple pie I'm just showing. But sometimes there's a whole bunch of things. One of the hardest things is when I'm taking care of a 19-year-old or a 14-year-old. Because what makes them better is their brain's got to develop, right? There's this concept of keep them alive till 25. Because when they're 19 and 20, man, they're hard to capture. Their impulse control is miserable. And if I literally can keep them alive to 24 or 25, there's a magic switch, they seem to get better. But there's nothing you and I can do about them. They just have to grow. Okay, so these are great books on addiction. If you liked some of this talk and thought, man, I need to learn more, you can take a smartphone picture of this, but you're going to get the slide deck anyway because we're going to put it on the website and you're going to sign up for it in the lobby. Any one of these books is great. That book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is that top middle book by Bessel van der Kolk, is the best book on trauma and what the ACE score does to the brain and the body of anything I've ever read. And if I have people in this room that are administrators or hospital administrators, or clinicians, or guidance counselors, that is the book that has changed how I have practiced more than anything else I've read in the last 15 years. It's an awesome book. I have a website now that my kid built for me. It has a lot of my videos on it, and it has all the books I just suggested on it. And it has some other stuff. It has my calendar on it. It's not perfect, but it's better than what I have, which is a big fat nothing. So it's my name. It's ruthpotee.com. And if you ever want to show this video or some component of it in a treatment center, let's say, or in a drug court, or in a jail, or anywhere, I don't care, use it, it's fine with me, spread the word as far as, my great Spanish interpreter said that you have a sister in Buenos Aires who's using some of that video there. That gave me the chills! I was thrilled with that, right? Because you think addiction is different when you cross country lines, it's all the same thing. So you guys have been a great audience. I'm happy to take questions. I know it's really late, but I'm happy to take questions. What questions do people have? Yes.
So my name is Eric. I'm a second-year medical student at UMass Medical School.
Awesome.
A bunch of my other friends. And I had a question. I know the talk wasn't necessarily about opioids, but so we know that the medical community had a large part to play. We know that people were erroneously saying that opioids were safe for chronic use, and we know that they've been pushed by different interest groups and the pharmaceutical companies, and so we know that things were pulled over the medical community's eyes. And I'm just wondering, have we done anything to prevent something like that from happening again? Like, are we going to get tricked by something else 15 years from now because the right strings are being pulled?
That's probably the smartest question I've ever been asked ever, and I love that he asked it. So I want to tell you, this generation, are all three of you UMass students? The whole group, that whole five, awesome. So this generation of medical students have a mandated curriculum on chronic pain and opiate prescribing. We're trying to get a mandated curriculum really on addiction, because the truth is every medical student should know at least this much about addiction. Because remember, I learned zero at Yale Medical School about addiction. But they should learn a lot about addiction, because 15 to 20% of their patients will have addiction, yet they come out knowing not much. So the question is, are we going to get the wool pulled over our eyes again? I'm sure we will, right? I'm sure we will. The study that the pain is the fifth vital sign was based on, the study that said, don't worry about prescribing OxyContin 80 3 times a day for your migraine patients. They're all good. They're going to be fine. Nobody gets addicted. Less than 1% of people get addicted. That's what Big Pharma told us. How do I know? Because Big Pharma told me that. I was a resident in the 1990s, and Big Pharma was feeding me 3 meals a day, and I was working 140 hours a week, and I basically listened to everything they said. The study that their data that they quote-unquote presented to me was based on was a single study done at Sloan Kettering, New York City, with 38 patients in it, 38. Their chronic use of opiates in that study was between 9 and 13 months, so I consider that fairly short-term use by today's standards, because people have been on opiates for decades at this point. And in this study, 2 of the 38 got addicted. So again, that's not 1% by anybody's math. But more importantly, in this study, they screened out all of the people who they thought might get addicted. They took out everybody who has a substance use disorder or a family history or genetic risk of substance use disorder. They scooted them out of the study. So they screened, they pre-screened and selected the best candidates. Let me be clear, the rest of us were not doing that. So, you know, the rest of your lives as clinicians, you're going to doubt everything. That's what you're going to do. You're going to go back to the original science and you're going to ask yourself, am I following the money? You know what makes people better? Regular exercise, good quality food, not smoking and not drinking in excess. I am like the lowest prescriber on the planet. You want to get off your statin? Come talk to me. I'll get you off your statin. My point is that the world of medicine is all about the prescribing. And instead, the world of medicine really needs to be about what can I do to support you in the healthiest lifestyle you can? How can I prevent disease? How can I make sure that you're vaccinated? I'm a huge vaccinator. And how can I help make sure that you live a full, healthy life, right? So it's not about the money. You should be prescribing generic, cheap medicine from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Anything more recent than that, you should be suspicious of it. So I'd say this generation is unbelievably smart. If you are asked to see a new young clinician, your answer should be yes, right? Because that generation knows what they're doing. But yeah, I'm worried about it too. Marijuana is going to pull the wool over our eyes. That's what I would say to you. I really think that the use of marijuana for medical purposes, there is definitely some benefit for some people. But you know what? People want to pretend it's the panacea, it's the cure-all. You hear it all the time. People act as though it's going to cure everything. It will not. And I tell you, the public health harms, we don't even know what's coming our way. It's a real worry to me. What other questions do people have? Yeah?
Ritalin. Children are prescribed Ritalin.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that? Or methamphetamine?
So her question is about the use of stimulants for the treatment of ADHD in children. So let's take a mental break for a minute and say that ADHD is a real disease. I believe that. I believe it is very much overdiagnosed and overtreated. And depending on where you live, it's really overdiagnosed. So the rates of ADHD in society are like 5%, really, 5%. Now, I don't know what the population in Marlborough is in the use of ADHD meds. I can tell you, there are western suburbs. I was in, where was I? Scituate, right? Scituate. There's some money in that town. The rates of stimulant use in that high school were like 20%. I want to be clear. 20% of the kids at Scituate High School do not have ADHD. This is performance-enhancing drugs to get your kid into college, right? That's what that is. So, I believe in ADHD. You've got to make sure that somebody's making the right diagnosis. You need to spend the time it takes with all the right surveys, the teacher surveys, the parent surveys, the neuropsych testing to really make sure your kid has it. And if your kid has it and they're really struggling in school, and more importantly to me, they're struggling socially in school. Because kids with ADD are a pain in the butt in the classroom and they don't have friends. Because they don't mean to be jerks, but they look like jerks. They're interrupting their friends. They're answering the question before everybody else. They can't sit down and they're in trouble, which makes everybody else in trouble. And they are just little kids who are trying to make some friends and learn a little bit. That's all, right? And so when parents come to me and we've made a diagnosis of ADHD and they say to me, I don't want them on meds, I spend a minute and I talk to the kid about what it feels like to be sort of a social outcast. It feels awful. And when that kid gets put on medicine and all of a sudden they have a friend again, right? You think I haven't changed a child's life? I have. So I believe in treatment of ADHD when it's diagnosed correctly, right? What do the studies show? there's a high rate of overlap between addiction and ADHD, but it's a chicken and egg theory, right? Is having terrible impulse control and being that brain that always says yes first and thinks later more likely to make you somebody who struggles with addiction? It is. And if I can make everybody stay on their ADHD meds when they're 15 so that I can control that impulse, they probably do better. And when I take care of people with addiction every day, if they have a childhood diagnosis of ADHD, I make sure they stay on their medicine and they do better in controlling their addiction. So I don't think that stimulants in a kid with ADHD creates addiction. I think that giving stimulants unnecessarily is a problem in society, though. So it's a complicated answer, but if I had a room full of child psychiatrists, they would beat each other up on the subject too. There's a lot of controversy on it. That book up there, Ruth Potee, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, talks a lot about the overlay between addiction and ADHD. He's a great writer. It's one of my favorite books. What other questions? Yes?
So I had a very disheartening experience today with a school nurse. And I had a student come in, she was diagnosed with tonsillitis, a lot of pain, prescribed 24 oxycodone. Now, is the AAP getting out the word, educating? What's the AAP doing for their prescribers?
Yeah, that's a stunning thing you just said to me, right? Because that's
She
crazy.
brought them out of the school.
On the bus or something?
So it's a great opportunity for education.
Wow, that's amazingly
I'm very
upsetting.
sorry.
Yeah, you should have been disheartened. First of all, I mean, I'm not telling you what to do because you're a great school nurse and you know what to do, but one of the things that we do when we train school nurses is we say, one, parents have got to be told, period. Like, I'm sorry, what the hell is that kid doing carrying their own bottle? She's not somebody who has parents who are watching over her, etc., right? She's coming from a chaotic high A score household, which puts her at high risk, right? You're just hearing how that unfolds in this one kid's life, that you could walk in with 24 pills. You think everybody would want to be her best friend today? In general, I will say pediatricians are pretty careful about prescribing opiates. In general, right? If your kid has cancer, you give them opiates. I don't ask any questions. But most other disease states for kids, you can get away with Tylenol and Motrin in combination. Every now and then, a really rare case, maybe I'll use some codeine, but very rarely. Now codeine has been shunted to the side. You shouldn't be using it in kids. So I am very unhappy about hearing that, and that seems rare.
It wasn't a pediatrician, it was her
Yeah, she's not an ENT surgeon. I have to say, most prescriptions for short-term opiates come from surgeons. They do surgery, right? They do things, and I think because they don't have chronic long-term relationships with people, it feels like, whoop, I'm done, right? So if that...
Aren't they aware?
Yes, everybody should be aware. We've been talking about it for years. There's no excuse. I think there's no excuse for that. I wish there had been somebody to protect that person. You know who it is? It's you, sadly. You're the one who has to protect. What I said, it's up to all of us as adults to protect kids, particularly those who aren't being protected. You stepped in today, and my hope is made some intervention that could change the outcome. She needs Tylenol and Motrin used together. She needs to gargle with some lidocaine. It's doable. Maybe one more question, and then we'll let you guys have a good night. Wow. Thank you for having me. Thanks for letting me.